Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today's video and the following videos, this will probably be a 2 or 3 part series. These videos will be about the disappearance of Susan Powell. But this is not a simple disappearance. This case has so many twists and turns, so many strange things and strange characters. It's really going to surprise you. Before we get started on our video, I want to talk to you really quickly about our sponsor for today's video, a sponsor that I think you guys are going to love. It definitely fits in with what I think we here in this community and on this channel are interested in, and it's Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new type of documentary streaming membership, and I know you guys love it when I say documentary. I guess I say it in a different way than normal, but that's just the way I say it. But Magellan TV is awesome. It has movies as well as series, and they add new programs every week. You can watch it anytime, anywhere, on your TV, your streaming device like a phone or a tablet or a laptop. It's so easy. So you can start a show on your television and then you have to go to the gym. You can finish it while you're on the treadmill. There's a wide selection of programs that are available in 4K without any additional cost, and you can watch these documentaries without interruptions. There's no ads or limited access. Some of the genres are biography, space, science and tech, mind and body, earth, nature, ancient history, current history, war and military, historical dramas, culture, and there's an entire genre just for crime and mystery. Magellan was founded by filmmakers. Their team of producers and curators bring together premium content which dives deep into diverse subjects and interests, and you can gain insight and knowledge about the topics that you're passionate about. Typically, the pricing for Magellan TV would be $6.99 a month. If you want to pay quarterly, it's $23.96, and annually for an entire year, it's only $59.88. But today, the first 100 visitors to go to magellantv.com/stephanieharlowe will get a 1-month free membership trial. I watched a movie on Magellan TV yesterday, which actually goes pretty much hand in hand with the topic that we're covering today, and the movie was called Killer in the Family. There's tons of stuff about Charles Manson on there, which I love. I was watching something called Manson 40 Years Later, and then there's also another series which I've become addicted to. It's called Crimes That Made History, and each episode covers a different case, like Jack the Ripper or Princess Diana. So if you guys are interested, all the information that you need is in the description box. You can check it out, see if it's something you'd be interested in, and try it if you want. Let's get right into the video. So the Susan Powell case is a case that I had heard of, vaguely, briefly here and there. I knew the framework for what happened, but I never really knew all the details. And I can tell you personally, once you get into all the details, this is a case you don't want to look away from. Some of the resources I used to research this case was the Cold podcast. This podcast takes a deep dive into the Susan Powell case. If you are interested in finding out more, because there's no possible way I could fit everything in, even into 3 videos, then you should definitely go and check that podcast out. It's very bingeable, and the guy who does it is incredibly good at getting all his details and putting them together into a very well-organized and easy to understand format. Additionally, I went through news programs and newspapers from that time and following the time to kind of piece together things there, and I did have a case file which had quite a bit of information in it as well. So that's pretty much what I used for this case, as well as some other internet resources. But I would say that 95% of the quotes or the journal entries that I was able to use for this video came from the Cold podcast. On February 5th, 2012, a quiet neighborhood in Washington state was stunned when one of their neighbors, a man named Josh Powell, set his house on fire, killing himself and his 2 young sons who were still inside. This came 3 years after the disappearance of his wife and the boy's mother, Susan Powell. What could cause a man to do such a horrible thing, not only to himself, but to his 2 young sons? As always, to understand the end, we have to go back to the beginning. In many ways, Susan Powell's story is one that many can relate to. In many ways, it's a story of finding yourself in a marriage that was different than the one you thought you were in. The constant struggles in a relationship of finances, opposing beliefs, children, in-laws, and feeling neglected by the one person you want attention from more than anyone else in the world. It's a story that transcends language, culture, and religion. It's an entirely human story. Josh Powell was born on January 20th, 1976. He was the second of 5 siblings, and he lived with his parents, Steve and Terry Powell, in Spokane, Washington. When Josh was born, both of his parents were active and practicing Mormons. But by the time Josh was 8 years old and his father, Steve, baptized him into the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, Josh's father had denounced all forms of religion, a fact he kept secret from his wife, Terry, who was a devout Mormon. Josh attended Franklin Elementary School, and it was clear from a very young age that he was quite intelligent. When he was in 4th grade, he was able to calculate the volume of the school's playground's sandbox on his own. By the time he was in 5th grade, he could do long division, which hadn't been taught yet. But Josh seemed more of a hands-on learner. He was able to learn and teach himself more complicated concepts as long as it was something that he was interested in. But as far as a standard and traditional academic structure where he had to passively sit in a classroom and learn things that were being taught to him, possibly things that weren't as interesting to him, he wasn't the best. The year he was in 5th grade, a break began in his parents' marriage. His mother, when she was 8 months pregnant with her youngest daughter, she found a journal that her husband Steve had hidden from her. The contents of this journal revealed a secret 2-year obsession that Steve had had for another man's wife. He wrote in great detail about the fantasies he had had about this woman, and when his wife confronted him with it, he seemed unapologetic. He said that if this woman's husband were to die, he would be more than willing to take her in as a plural wife and raise her children as his own. Now, plural marriages at this point were no longer being practiced by the LDS Church, and besides that fact, Steve Powell was not a Mormon. He was not practicing any religion. He'd given that up years ago. Terry, who was about to give birth, was not happy with this response. In fact, it scared her. She thought that Steve might go so far as to make sure something happened to this other woman's husband to ensure that he could live out his fantasies in real life. Even though Steve was no longer a practicing Mormon, he still went to church with his family every Sunday in the beginning. But behind the scenes, he was telling his 3 sons, Josh, John, and Michael, that Mormons were bad. He said that the Mormon religion was a farce, it was false, and it was dangerous. He also told them from a very young age that humans were just animals. Therefore, they should be allowed to have sex with whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted. This went against everything that Terry was trying to raise her children to believe. According to the Mormon faith, sexual desire should only be fulfilled through heterosexual marriages, with the dual purpose of creating life and reinforcing and strengthening the couple's bond. Sex outside of marriage was banned by the Mormon Church, and this included premarital sex. Steve also kept pornography inside of the home, which was also explicitly forbidden by the LDS Church. And more disturbing than anything, Steve wrote in his journal that he was feeling attracted to their oldest daughter, Jennifer. He wrote, quote, "I remember many times sitting at the breakfast bar in our home when she would come into the kitchen in the morning, dressed in a t-shirt and panties. That would drive me nuts. We went on a trip one time, just the 2 of us, and she wandered around in our hotel room in nothing but a bra and panties." Jennifer, along with the other children, were being raised as Mormons, but Steve wanted to put a stop to that for his own selfish reasons, I assume. When Jennifer was a teenager, he told her that the Book of Mormon wasn't real. His wife found out about that, and she was livid. This ended up being a breaking point for her, and she moved out for a time, but she did return. Josh, too, would find his father's pressing influence affecting his choices and the way that he lived his life. He loved being a Boy Scout and going on camping trips with his troop, but since the troop was funded and run by the LDS Church, Steve hated it. He shamed Josh, made fun of him, and teased him for his interests. And eventually, after being made to feel stupid for liking Boy Scouts, Josh just stopped going. He turned instead to darker hobbies. When he was 13, he chased his mother around with a knife. He also killed his little sister Alina's gerbils and then made her touch their blood. She was 4 at the time. And Terry claims she once walked in on her sons, her 2 oldest sons, Josh and John, examining Alina. The year after, when Josh was 14, he attempted to hang himself. When his mother saw the rope burn on his neck, she insisted that he get help and go to counseling. So right off the bat, we can clearly see that Steve Powell was a troubled and disturbed individual, and his son Josh, and possibly his other sons, were following right along in his footsteps. When Terry moved back home, she and Steve tried to go to counseling in order to make the marriage work. Divorce in the LDS church is a tricky thing. A marriage performed in an LDS temple is a celestial marriage, meaning it's eternal. It doesn't just last while you're here on earth. When you get married in the LDS temple, it's assumed that you are tied to this person for all of eternity, and you'll be together in life and after. In the early days, when plural marriage was still being practiced in the LDS church, this meant that a man could marry as many women as he wanted, and they would all be bound together in the celestial kingdom. Can you imagine? Now, both men and women may enter a celestial marriage with only one partner at a time, but if a man's wife dies, he can enter into a celestial marriage with another woman, and he will be considered sealed to both his deceased wife and his current wife. In the celestial kingdom, they will all live together. So it's a very serious commitment to Mormons to get married, because you will theoretically be with this person forever, for an eternity. Despite her husband's shortcomings and progressively outrageous behavior, Terry really did want this marriage to work. She was doing everything she could to raise her children in the faith that she truly believed in, while Steve Powell, living under the same roof, was doing everything that he could to damage the work she was doing. He even began writing for anti-LDS papers and speaking out publicly against the church. There's a couple themes that will constantly reveal themselves as we find out more and more about Josh Powell. And these themes, for the most part, remain consistent throughout his life. One of these was his constant desire to connect with somebody of the opposite sex and his constant frustration that he couldn't. But it wasn't for lack of trying. Josh had incredibly high self-esteem, and he had no problem approaching girls. They just never seemed to be interested in him. They only wanted to be friends. He would then continue pursuing them to the point where it would become inappropriate. When he was 16, he met a girl named Sarah, who was a few years older than him. He was romantically interested in her, but she simply saw him as a church friend and a younger brother of sorts. After he'd made several advances towards her, she let him know that she was about to go off to college and she had no interest in starting a relationship. She told him that she would just like to be friends, and he said, okay, but one day he kissed her out of the blue. Josh would constantly be friend-zoned by these girls. But even after clear boundaries were set by them, he would ignore them, and oftentimes he would just plow right through them. I suspect to Josh Powell, the boundaries that they set didn't even exist to him. He seemed like the kind of guy who, if he heard the word no, he would think you'd said try harder. And we will soon see that he gets this from his father. Another theme and pattern that will emerge in the life of Josh Powell is his inability to succeed in the workforce. He had a hard time keeping a job, and he was never able to really decide and settle on one thing that he wanted to do. When he was still in high school, he got a job at the local car wash, but when money went missing out of a car during his shift, he was fired. Around this time, while Josh is dealing with being rejected by Sarah and then fired by the car wash, Steve Powell has a conversation with his son while he's driving him to school. I guess that Steve thought this would be a good time to break it to Josh that he and his mother were getting a divorce. And this appears to have been very traumatic for 16-year-old Josh. It was all he could think about at school during the day. He was very distracted. He kept wondering why his mother would do something like this. And then when he got home, there was a kind of intervention set up in his living room. His mother was there, her brothers, his uncles were there, and the bishop from their church. And pretty much she told him mostly what Steve had already told him, that they were getting a divorce. She was going to be staying in the house, and he was welcome to continue living there, but there was going to be rules he'd have to follow now, and Josh had never had rules before. These rules were pretty simple and straightforward: no swearing or crude talk, no R-rated movies, and curfews at 11 p.m. Terry presented her son with a paper that listed these rules, and at the bottom it said, if you break any of these rules, Mom reserves the right to throw you out. And Josh was expected to sign it, contractually stating that he saw and understood what she was saying and what she expected of him. But he was angry and he lashed out. He blamed his mother for the divorce, and he told her he wasn't going to be following her rules. That night, he and his brother decided to go to a party, which Terry was fine with, but as they were leaving, she said, "Just make sure you're home by 11, or the door's probably going to be locked." Josh had no plans of being home by 11, and I don't think he took her seriously, because later that evening, he called her, and he was like, "Is the door really going to be locked if we don't come home by 11? And she was like, "I don't know, try it out and see what happens," which made him angry all over again. He said, "I'm not coming home," and he hung up, and he didn't go home that night. And he didn't go home the next night either. Basically hid out and stayed with a friend. His father tracked him down and extended an offer to him that he couldn't refuse. Steve said that he was getting his own apartment and that his brother John would be living with him, and would Josh like to live there as well? Josh did. I asked myself while going through this case, was this the point where Josh started resenting women and needing to have control over them? He already blamed her for the divorce. He didn't like her taking charge of her own life and her own household, or setting rules for those who would be living in her household. This anger and resentment also shows itself in a letter he wrote to his old friend Sarah, who had gone off to college, the one he tried to kiss, and she'd friend-zoned him. She was telling him in the letter how different college was from high school, and for some reason, Josh Powell took this very personally as an insult. He wrote back to her, "I never said anything before when you offended me. I assumed it would stop. It will stop. If you have to keep saying other people are better than me, then don't. Say it to someone else. Sorry if I seem like a jerk, I'm just mad. I'm tired of you patronizing me. I'm better than most of the people I know. I'm not being conceited either. It's just a fact. It's about time you realize it." Such a venomous and self-righteous response to what seemed to be an innocent letter showed just how highly Josh thought of himself, and how anyone that didn't share this lofty opinion of himself could kick rocks. His unwarranted aggression towards this girl, who he had expressed romantic interest in before, his overinflated ego, his defensiveness, well, with a role model, a male role model like Steve Powell, who could really be surprised? His parents' divorce was not amicable. It became very ugly very quickly. Steve told the courts that his wife was a religious freak, a zealot, even an occultist. His two sons that were living with him, Josh and John, signed declarations against their mother after being coached on what to say by their father. In Josh's declaration, he said, "We seem to do a lot of arguing over religion and where and when we have to go to church and what we have to believe. I feel that it is a lot of scare tactics and brainwashing, and I think the younger kids should be protected from that." Jennifer, who was not under her father's spell and was the only other child besides Josh and John who was old enough to understand what was happening, she wasn't having it. She told the courts that it wasn't her mother that the kids needed to be protected from. It was her father and her brothers. She told the story of a day when her father and her brothers had come over the house. Her mother, Terry, had some legal paperwork in her hand, and Steve Powell tried to grab the papers out of her hand. When Terry resisted, he slapped her. When Jennifer grabbed the phone to try and call the police, Steve yelled at her to put the phone down. She did put the phone down, but she also grabbed up the papers that her parents had been fighting over, and she ran outside with the intention to get into her car and lock the doors. She didn't make it to the car, however, because once she got out into the front yard, she was tackled by Josh. He tackled her to the ground, and then he held her so she couldn't move, and the two began to wrestle and roll around in the grass for these papers. Steve Powell came to the door and told them to both get inside. He knew that they were doing this in full view of the neighborhood, and even though he wasn't a good guy, he didn't want everybody to know it. He didn't want everybody to know what was happening behind closed doors. Steve still had access to the home even though he wasn't living there, and he was involved in a very hostile divorce. He told the judge that he had an office there and he needed to be able to come and go as he pleased so that he could work from that office or retrieve things from that office, and for some reason the judge thought that this would be a perfectly acceptable situation. But of course, Steve Powell didn't restrain his activities to his home office. He roved around the house looking for things that he could use to incriminate Terry in the divorce or things that she was planning to use against him. There was times that he even accessed her bedroom, so she had to put a deadbolt on it. And when she did put a deadbolt on it, he tried to cut it off. He also took things out of the house that he had no right to take. One day, he was trying to leave the house with a chair when Jennifer tried to stop him. He grabbed her hair and pulled so hard that a couple strands of her hair were left in his hand. After this, the court did take notice. Terry was granted custody of the two younger children, Michael and Alina, but Steve was granted visitation. He had no sense for respect or boundaries. He would show up to Michael and Alina's school when he wasn't expected and wasn't supposed to be there, and he would take them out of the school for lunch. On days that he was allowed to have them, he would keep them for several days after he was supposed to return them. I think this was his attempt to regain control over a wife that he thought he'd lost control of. Additionally, I think that it was a sign to Terry that he could take the kids whenever and she wouldn't be able to find him. Jennifer spoke of a game that her grandparents, Steve's parents, had played with their own children during their own divorce. The game consisted of one or the other taking the kids and hiding them to see how long it took for the other parent to find them. They called this game the kidnap game, which sounds like a whole lot of fun. Terry consistently lived in fear that one day her estranged husband would take Michael and Alina and never come back. Not only did Michael and Alina become pawns in this game that Steve Powell was playing with his wife, but Steve, Josh, and John also made attempts to turn the two youngest children against their mother, telling them that Terry was the reason they couldn't all be together. Terry was the reason that they couldn't live happily ever after, and they couldn't see their dad as much anymore. Jennifer said that although her father never made an attempt to kidnap those kids, in a way he did kidnap them. He kidnapped them mentally. He had a way of twisting facts to make it seem as if Terry, their mother, was the evil one and the bad one and the one whose fault all of this was. And I feel so bad for Michael and Alina at this time, because a man who would use his own children or hurt his own children in order to hurt his wife is an evil man. I don't care what else he did before or after. I don't care if he's the nicest guy in the world. If he ever does that to me, you're evil. In his journal at this time, Josh referred to his mother as a treasure seeker who wanted to bleed Steve Powell for all he had. He also called his sister Jennifer a witch, and in a letter to a friend, he said, "I would kind of like my mom to be dead." During his junior year, Josh struggled in school and his grades showed it. He was distracted, and in a way, I think he was torn. He was obviously on his father's team, but his mother said there would be times where she'd see a glimmer of her son, the son that she knew. He would seem to disapprove of what John and Steve were saying or doing, but that glimmer of hope would pass as soon as it came. When Josh was a senior in high school, Steve moved to Puyallup, Washington, about a 4.5-hour drive from his old home. Changing schools a few months before graduation didn't help Josh's grades or feelings about school in general. He didn't make many friends, but he quickly attached himself to a girl named Mary Cox from his high school. Once again, this girl was not interested in being his girlfriend either, and the pattern with Josh and women continued on. For someone who was constantly striking out, Josh seemed to think he had a good handle on what marriage was and what made it successful. When his sister Jennifer got married to her husband, Kirk Graves, in 1994, he attended the wedding. Afterwards, he wrote in his journal, "If I were to place a wager on the outcome of their marriage, I would have to bet against longevity. Who knows, maybe they'll beat the odds." Maybe it was because Jennifer and Kirk had only been dating 6 months before they got married. Maybe Josh was secretly jealous that his sister had found love and he couldn't even find a date. Or maybe he was bitter because his father had not been invited to the wedding. He managed to graduate from high school despite his academic troubles, and he started working at a cabinet shop in Kent. He also tried to start his own woodworking business called Powell's Custom Furniture. He ran and operated this business out of a storage unit. Needless to say, it wasn't successful. Steve, meanwhile, was trying to do everything in his power to make Terry's life as miserable as possible, even from afar. He refused to pay child support, and he continually called CPS on her to report her for neglect. The fall after Josh graduated, he enrolled at Pierce College. Josh purchased a motorcycle and he took to wearing a black leather jacket. In fact, his day-to-day look was very James Dean-esque. He wore his black leather jacket, a white tee, blue jeans, and sneakers every day. The motorcycle was his only means of transportation from home to school and work, but it was also around this time that he began to become disenchanted with his father a bit. The environment living with Steve Powell was very hostile, and Josh said that Steve was always encouraging his children to argue with each other about religion. While at Pierce, he was given a couple of joke awards in the spring of 1996, Mr. Know-It-All and Mr. Political. One of his professors remembered Josh being very introverted, at least in his classes, but he remembers exactly where he sat and a girl who always sat next to him. His calculus professor remembered Josh being a very active participant in class, always reaching out if he needed more help. He said he was an overall terrific student. The girl who Josh's professor was referring to, the one who always sat next to him in class, may have been Becky. Becky was a fellow student. He'd met her at one of his classes, and he was interested in her, and she seemed, legitimately, to reciprocate his interest. But in the end, he felt that their values were too different to work. He wrote in his journal about Becky and what she liked to do on her downtime, how she liked to go dancing. He said, quote, "I think dancing is an intimate activity to be shared with a loved one. I don't see the point of dancing with strangers. She went to bars with her girlfriends, and one time while I knew her, she went by herself since her friends weren't available. I think this is not a ladylike activity. I've decided to direct more energy into finding a girl that has similar attitudes on love, intimacy, time, education, alcohol, and such issues." Wow, so much judgment in so few sentences. A lot of things would change about and for Josh in his college years. As I'd stated earlier, Josh had started to notice the negative effects of living with his father. So when he left Pierce and enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle, he decided to live on campus. But that wasn't much more of a positive experience for him. Remember, he has certain attitudes on love, intimacy, education, alcohol, and other such issues. But this was a college dorm that he shared with other young men that didn't necessarily share his views on these issues. His roommates threw parties where there was booze and drugs available, and Josh often felt pressured by them to partake. They got a real kick out of him because he didn't drink and he didn't swear and he didn't have sex, and so they would tease him and sometimes even bully him. One of the pranks they played on him was telling him that another student, a gay student, was at one of these parties and that this student was interested in having a relationship with Josh, and when Josh recoiled in horror, they got a kick out of it. They teased him and they were like, "Isn't college about having new experiences? Isn't that what you're here for?" Finally, he requested a room transfer, stating in a letter to the college, "Throughout my stay in that first apartment, I was bombarded with loud noises throughout the night. I was the subject of a sick joke that became sexual harassment. My personal belongings were stolen by my roommates or their guests, and I was a victim of assault and battery." The assault and battery claim that he's making there happened when his roommate basically tackled him to the floor. I'm not sure if it was aggressive or if they were just playing around, but that is what he's talking about. Here, while he was living on campus, Josh discovered the internet. Now, he'd been online before, but this was a whole new world. He had a high-speed internet connection. He was able to kind of close the door to his room and just spend hours and hours alone surfing the internet. He made his first email address while he was here. And he had started out at the University of Washington studying architecture, but he didn't stick with that for very long. By 1997, he had decided that he was going to be an actor, so he became involved with the school's drama program, and he even got a part in the school's production of Little Abner. But it wasn't even a speaking role, and he was kind of agitated about this. He thought that his acting skills were so good, he deserved a bigger part, so he gave up. He just didn't want to be an actor anymore. Instead of doubling down and perfecting his craft and working hard to get better, he gave up. Josh thought he was depressed and he didn't know why. His inability to succeed at anything, his inability to get a girl to go out on a date with him, it did not help his increasing feelings of loneliness, sadness, and depression. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "My dad seems to always get mad at me when he sees me. My brother and I concluded that my dad resents me. He often says rude things to and about me. Actually, the things he says are not true. He perceives them because he wants to. I try not to get mad, but it's hard sometimes." So like I said earlier, Josh had a very high self-esteem, And he didn't have a problem just walking up to a girl and saying, "Hey, I like you, you're pretty." And he did just this with another girl. She was part of a college group called Campus Crusaders for Christ. And he began to spend time with her and her friends who were all born-again Christians. It had been a while since Josh had participated in any religious activities. Since leaving his mother's home, he hadn't really wanted to. But now he found a group of people who were all friendly, warm, and welcoming, and that struck a chord in him. Josh wrote in his journal an experience that he had at one of these events, which is very indicative to how incredibly isolated and lonely he was feeling. He said, quote, "Many of us were sitting on the floor. A cute little black baby boy came up to me and sat on my lap. He said, 'I love you.' I knew he did. And in my heart, he was the only one who did love me at the time." Finding a potential place to belong, Josh also became born again. But at the end of the school year, when Josh had to move back in with his father for the summer, this became a point of contention between the two of them. Josh had rediscovered faith, and Steve was vehemently against any form of religion. They got into constant arguments, and Josh finally realized that this was probably what his mother went through with Steve, what she experienced trying to practice her own beliefs and her own faith in her own home and feeling constant pressure and criticism to not do so. So he returned to Spokane to reconnect with his mother and her side of the family. Throughout learning about Josh Powell, his life and experiences, it had often struck me how odd it was that someone could seem at times so introspective and self-aware, and at other times so completely clueless about the things he was doing and how wrong they were. He wrote in his journal around this time, "I think certain aspects of my character could use some improvements. I may be a much easier person to be around with these minor adjustments. For instance, I say what I think. Sometimes I need to remember that people don't want to hear some things." Terry, seeing a change in her son, encouraged him to move towards a more positive path. She suggested that he start going to some youth activities at the LDS church. He wrote in his journal, "My mom suggested that I go to family home evening. I decided to go and hang out there until I could make some real friends at Eastern Washington University. But as I went each week, I found my old friends from junior high school. They were nice to me, and I made some real friends, despite the fact that I told them I wasn't at all interested in their church." His family at this time noticed this change in him. He was calmer, more even-keeled, more open-minded. In the past, he'd been so angry with his mother and sister, but now it seemed like he wanted to mend fences. He enrolled in Eastern State Washington University, and this is where he met Catherine, who would become his first real girlfriend. Catherine was originally from Utah, and she was part of the LDS Church, but she moved from Utah to Spokane, Washington to live with her aunt and her uncle after graduating from high school and having a rough breakup from a boyfriend. When she got there, she started going to Singles Ward, which is where she met Josh. A singles ward was basically a place that single LDS church members could go to meet other single church members. They were like separate congregations presided over by a separate bishop, but only single adults would attend. In 2017, the LDS Church made a decision to phase out single wards altogether. John S. Young, the head of the Latter-day Saint Marriage and Matchmaking Department, stated, "The brethren have unanimously agreed that it was time to stop making our bishops play matchmaker, and for the church to officially retract President Brigham Young's Menace to Society statement." So, for some context and a quick tidbit of interesting history, Brigham Young was the second president of the LDS Church from 1847 until he died in 1877. He was also the founder of Salt Lake City, and Brigham Young University is named for him. Additionally, Young was a polygamist with 55 wives. 54 of these women were not Mormons when they met him. He converted them. So obviously, depending on how you look at it and what you believe in, he was a controversial character. He did make a statement at one point that single men over the age of 27 are a menace to society. He pretty much thought that if men didn't get married by that age, they were just gonna run rampant and, cause trouble. It's widely debated whether Brigham Young ever actually said this, but it has been used for generations by mothers and grandmothers to encourage their male offspring to not drag their feet when finding a wife. Anyways, back to Josh and Catherine. She was 19 and he was 22. As usual, he was the initiator. He introduced himself to Catherine, and she thought he was cute. But initially, he told her that he just wanted to be friends. And I almost have to wonder if this was some kind of like reverse psychology thing that Josh Powell was trying out. Like every time I talk to girls, they tell me they want to be friends. But if I say that I want to be friends before they can say it, maybe they'll feel rejected enough to want to be my girlfriend. Eventually, obviously, it did turn into more. After they officially started dating, Josh went to visit his sister Jennifer in Utah for a few weeks, and he talked to Catherine every night on the phone. But at one point he got scared and thought that they were moving too fast, so he ended it. But then he changed his mind again, and he wanted her back. And this time Catherine was a little hesitant. Not only because he had flip-flopped so many times, and that can get kind of exhausting in a relationship, but because not only did he want her back, but he wanted her to move in with him, and cohabitating and premarital sex and all of that jazz, that's strictly forbidden by the LDS Church, which they were both part of. Catherine's uncle disapproved of this decision and her relationship with Josh in general, but Catherine moved in with Josh anyway. He was living back at Steve Powell's house, and Catherine moved in with him there. And the intention was that while they lived there, they could save money and get their own place. But while they were living there, Josh spent every cent he had. He was just buying everything, things for their new apartment, furniture, stuff like that, for an apartment that they wouldn't even be able to afford, because they didn't have any money after he was done buying everything for the inside of this apartment. After he was done spending all of his money, he spent Catherine's too. Catherine and Josh would sometimes work for Steve installing furniture, and whenever Catherine got a paycheck, Josh would have her sign it over to him, and he would deposit it in his own bank account that she didn't have any access to. And that would be the last she'd see of the money that she'd earned. Catherine also made some observations about Josh's family and his siblings while she lived there. She said that his younger sister Alina was a nice girl, a good kid. John was cold and detached, and Michael was like Josh's little shadow. Whenever Josh was around, Michael would follow him and want to do everything he was doing and want to be with him. She said that Steve Powell was nice, like a father figure to her, but she did notice that there was a lot of tension between him and Josh, and they were constantly arguing. What did stick out to her, though, was that Josh never seemed to want Catherine to be alone with any of his family members. Like, he didn't want them to talk or be together one-on-one. Then a few months, they got a small apartment in Seattle. Josh went back to the University of Washington, and Catherine enrolled in the local community college. When Catherine's student loan check arrived at their apartment, Josh took it and deposited it into his own account. He did not give her the money, and according to her, to this day, that debt is still there on her credit. When there was some structural issues with their apartment, Josh thought that he might turn his attention to a career in law. He wrote a letter to his aunt saying, "I am considering becoming a lawyer because I have no respect for that ilk. I would not be afraid to slaughter my opponents. I would go after bad people of all sorts, especially lawyers and judges." So he wants to start his own furniture company. He wants to be an architect, then an actor, and now a lawyer who goes after other lawyers, a cannibal lawyer. And this is what I'm talking about, the way he goes from thing to thing to thing. Once it becomes something that seems like it might be too hard or that he has to put actual work into, he moves on to the next. He yo-yos between periods of actual self-awareness and then delusions of grandeur. It seems as if the nice young man who had started to get back onto the right path had backslid and was up to his old ways. Although they were technically living in sin, Josh thought it would be a good idea for he and Catherine to join a married congregation. So a congregation in the LDS Church for married people only. And he told her that if anybody asked if they were married, that she should lie and say yes. This made her uncomfortable. Not only was what they were doing living together wrong, but now Josh wanted her to put on this facade and put on this show of being his wife when he would tell her privately that he had no interest in ever getting married or even having kids. As a girl who had been raised in the LDS Church, it was an understanding for her that she would get married and have a family and raise her family in the same faith. And now all of a sudden, after this guy had convinced her to move in with him and lie to the church, he was telling her he didn't even want to get married or have kids. The control began. In small ways at first. Catherine would make friends at church and Josh didn't like it, so he'd find a way to get in between the relationships. There was a computer in their apartment, but it was Josh's, and Catherine was only allowed to use the computer when he was there. And I mean there, right there, sitting next to her, looking over her shoulder at what she was writing. Neither of them had a car. They only had Josh's motorcycle, which Catherine did not know how to drive. So if she wanted to go anywhere, she had to go with Josh. One day, Catherine decided to get acrylic nails put on, which she was very proud of. She was feeling very pretty, and she showed them to her boyfriend. And he turned around and told her he hated it. He thought they were ugly and stupid, and he hated them. So she ripped them off, or tried to rip them off her own fingers, which anybody who's ever had acrylic nails put on knows how difficult this can be, especially when they're fresh. When she couldn't get all the nails off, she had to go back to the salon to have them removed, which is a very painful process. And as a result of her trying to tear these acrylic nails off and having to go to the salon to basically have them pried apart from her real nails, she acquired a vicious infection in one of her fingers. As she cried in bed that night from the pain of the infection, Josh simply turned his back on her and said, "You did this to yourself." When her uncle died, Josh wouldn't let her go to the funeral because he was still salty about her uncle not supporting their relationship initially. She began to realize at one point that her boyfriend was exerting much too much control over her life, and that if she pushed back even a little bit, he would get angry and sullen. One night, they got into an argument. She locked herself in the bathroom and he forced his way in. Finally, in March of 1999, Catherine took a trip back home to Utah to visit her family. And with some time and distance and perspective, she realized just how toxic and unhealthy the relationship she had with Josh Powell was. So she called him and told him she wasn't going to come back, and could he just put her things into storage. After Catherine left and he couldn't steal her money anymore, Josh got some roommates to help him pay the rent in an apartment near the college campus. Now, these were church friends, people that he knew from church, so they were definitely more his speed than his previous college roommates, yet he still found a way to find fault with them. He did all the grocery shopping. He insisted on doing all the grocery shopping, but then he would get agitated if somebody ate something that he bought. He wrote in his journal, "They don't seem to appreciate all the things I do for them. I owe them nothing. It makes me want to unshare and get rid of them. I just want them gone, so I don't mind being a nuisance to them. Boy, will I be happy when they aren't wearing out my nice things anymore. I probably shouldn't get too mean with these guys because it could affect my reputation." So something to note about Josh is he liked to spend money, and most of the time it was money that he didn't have, running up debts on credit cards, etc. He wanted to buy things that he wanted, and he liked having nice things, but he was very possessive over these things. Even if these things were located in a shared space, he would still get greedy and obsessive and possessive about them. He reminds me of the person who does things for people, but then gets angry when those people don't behave in the way he wants them to. I did this for you, now I own you, or now you have to do what I want you to do, or be who I want you to be, or you're insulting me and being ungrateful. We find Josh again in 1999 while he's living at this off-campus apartment, becoming obsessed with yet another girl. This girl was Brazilian. She spoke Portuguese, so he tried to learn the language so that he could communicate with her, I guess, even though she also did speak English. He wasn't shy about showing her just how interested he was in her. Even though they weren't dating, he would show up at her house unannounced and bring things like a plant or flowers. He wrote her these lengthy, oversharing letters about his mother and father's divorce, about his search for religion, about his experiences with past girlfriends. It got to the point where he was showing up at her house unannounced so often, she had to say, "Listen, my parents don't like this. You can't do this. You have to give me a heads up if you come by." And here's what he wrote about that in his journal. "My general experience is that most girls hate that, but that's the way I am. That's the way I'd like to be." Spontaneous and creepy. And it gives you an idea of how quickly he would get attached, even though not only were they not dating, but this girl had made it clear to him that she wasn't romantically interested in him. He devoted time to talking about her in his journals, writing her these literally long letters, and continuing to drop by unannounced. Once this happened some more, the girl finally put her foot down and she was like, listen, this is over. This can't happen, okay? We can be friends, but that's all I want. You gotta stop coming to my house. Okay, so they decided to be friends. That's great, that's fine, whatever. He moves on. Oh, he did move on very quickly, in fact, to her younger sister. And he repeated his same pushy and creepy tactics with her, which even he seemed to realize weren't being received well. He wrote in his journal, if there was a girl who was interested in my brother and then she got interested in me, I would probably be very cautious with her too. I might feel like I was her second choice. The sister was more than cautious. She was not interested in Josh, and she found it incredibly creepy when he would just show up at her house or her job, sometimes carrying a video camera. Even though this girl repelled his advances as her sister had done, he showed up to her house with flowers and asked her to be his girlfriend. She promptly friend-zoned him. But he sent her letters afterwards, like he had sent to her sister, oversharing personal details, expressing feelings of love and passion that could not possibly actually exist. He said at the end of one of these letters, I want you to love me. I love you. When you said you wanted to be friends, I tried to get over you, but no other girl comes close. The only thing I don't love about you is that I can't reach you. It's a super great way to close out a letter where you're trying to get a girl to be your girlfriend by telling her the things you don't like about her. And to even use the word love with a girl that you barely know, that you haven't even been on a date with, and who has consistently repelled any advances that you've made, it's a little concerning. He fell in love with almost every single girl he met. He thought he'd found the one anytime he found anyone. Was it just a desperation to connect with someone? Or was Josh's failure to understand and respect boundaries a sign of something darker? When his roommates began to get in the way of his infatuation with these two girls by telling them who Josh really was, he'd had enough and left the apartment and Seattle. He moved back in with Steve in January. If you thought it was the end of Josh's creepy romantic interests, you're wrong. They keep going. In March, he visited his sister Jennifer in Utah, and he'd been chatting online with a girl who was in one of the LDS group, kind of matchmaking chats online. And so I guess while he was in Utah visiting Jennifer, he decided that he would meet up with this girl. Now, in my opinion, I don't think he actually went to Utah to see Jennifer. I think he went to see this girl that he'd been talking to briefly online, because this is what he says in his journal. I went down there to Utah to see her, spent a couple weeks and a few thousand miles, the furthest I've ever driven, for a date that was a great experience, although obviously it didn't work out. Obviously, the girl said that there was something about Josh that gave her the creeps, but if Josh noticed that she was creeped out by him, he didn't seem to recognize it or admit it. He wrote in his journal, we have had that understanding that when we're together, it is about each other. Even if I may not marry her, I was thinking about how sweet she is to me. This is a girl he's spoken to online a few times, a girl he's met in person once, and he continues to talk about her in his journal, even when it's ended and she's not talking to him anymore. He returned to Washington, but he couldn't remain living with his father for much longer. He only lasted about 6 months more. Steve was not supportive of Josh's religious beliefs. There was always swearing and alcohol in the household. So Josh moved out and he got his own apartment in Tacoma, this time solo. The whole roommate thing had not worked out for him very well before, so he figured it was best to just keep to himself. He enrolled in business school at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and he became an active member of the church there. Even though he made some friends, including girls, none of these girls were interested in being anything more than friends with Josh. This is reflected in a passage that he wrote in his journal. I often just feel that I can't get through to any girl that I really like. that the only girls that pay attention to me are the ones that I'm not interested in anyway. But it was here in Tacoma that he met the 19-year-old girl who would one day become his wife and the mother of his children. Her name was Susan Cox, and he'd actually met her before, a long time ago, when she was 12 and he was 18. Remember Mary Cox, another girl that Josh had tried to have a relationship with, but she just wanted to be friends. So while they were friends, Josh went over to Mary's house and he played the piano. When they met for the second time, he spotted her at a church activity called Institute. Institute is a religious class for young adults aged 18 to 30. The point of Institute is to strengthen the relationship with Jesus at a crucial period in someone's life. Josh thought Susan was pretty, so he went up to talk to her, and that's when they discovered that they had met before. Josh had been a senior in high school, 18 years old. It was pretty much right after he had moved to Powell with his dad. Here are his own words from his journal, where he remembers the day that he met Susan when she was 12. So we had met at her house, and she remembered me as the person who came over and played piano. But she was much too young, relatively speaking, for me to consider dating. But if I think back, I think that I looked at her and thought, she is really cute. Too bad she's too young. Now, 5 or 6 years isn't a huge age gap in a relationship when you're in your 20s or your 30s, but when you're 12 and 18, it is. And the fact that an 18-year-old man was looking at a 12-year-old child and thinking, she's cute, too bad she's not old enough for me to date, it's a serious red flag. Something's not right about Josh Powell. At this time, Josh was very much in debt, and he could barely make ends meet, but he still decided to have these dinner parties at his house for friends and church acquaintances. It seemed, according to his private thoughts, that these dinner parties and the guests at them were perceived by him as intrusions and an annoyance. He wrote, "People come over to my house, and instead of eating what I'm offering them, they look in my freezer. Oh, I want to make orange juice to go with dinner, and I want to cook this with our dinner. Well, eventually, when they start doing that, it gets extremely expensive to have these dinners, so I felt like that has been a burden that I can't take." See what I mean about him being that person? The person who invites you over for dinner and asks what you want to drink, and you say orange juice, and he's like, seriously? Seriously? It's not as if he offered them Johnny Walker Red Label and they took his Blue Label and poured it. I can literally see Josh serving up dinner and counting out like 3 tater tots per plate. And then if anybody wants another tater tot or tries to take another tater tot, he's like, come on, man. Susan Cox attended one of these dinner parties, and after they ate, she volunteered to help him clean up and do the dishes. He wrote about this later in his journal. She said that doing dishes together with me, that very moment she decided that she loved me. And for me, doing dishes with her was a turning point for me when I thought, it's not over. He was referring to the fact that he'd been pursuing her since he met her at the Institute, but there was another boy, a friend of his, who was also interested in Susan, and they were kind of competing for her attention until it got too hard and Josh gave up like he does with everything. That night they kissed, and Susan said in that moment she knew that Josh was the one. Finally, Josh Powell had found someone who returned his affections, who wasn't going out and dancing and drinking at a bar by herself, God forbid. Susan thought Josh was a pretty good catch. He was older than her, had his own apartment, he was going to college, and he seemed to have his life together. She also thought he was attractive, a church boy who drove a motorcycle and wore a leather jacket, but Josh did not have his life together. He was deep in debt and in a precarious financial situation, which you can decipher from his own words written in his journal. In the past, it seems like I've had the goal of have more now, have a computer now, have a TV and VCR and all these things now, and forget about the future. Don't worry about saving money. I went into debt pretty heavily. 19-year-old Susan had a clean credit history, which gave her a whole new appeal to Josh Powell. Josh and Susan began seeing each other, and he talked about her in an audio journal he kept. Not only did he keep a written journal, but he kept an audio journal. I think she is incredibly beautiful, and a lot of that is because of the way she treats me. It's the way she takes care of me and my house. She comes in here, and she is the one person that I can feel comfortable with in my house. She'll start doing the dishes or dust something. just because she is standing there for a minute and she doesn't have anything else to do. And I know that this is a real part of her, and it's important to me to have someone who takes care of me and our stuff and our space together. It's an odd way to talk about someone you've just started dating. He doesn't talk about her attributes in a way that they stand on their own, apart from him. He talks about how she makes him feel, what she does for him, how she takes care of him and his stuff. He feels comfortable with her being in his apartment because she's not going to wear out all of his nice things and drink all of his orange juice. November 11th, 2000 was their official dating date. That's the day they started dating. It was their first date, and it was also the time that they first started talking about marriage. Josh speaks in this slow, breathy, creepy voice in his audio journal about Susan. How he knows that she's the one. I love this girl, Susan Marie Cox. Every day I love her more. I become more and more certain that I want to be with her. So I'm slow to warm up. It's taken me a while to realize that I do want to be with her forever. After Susan graduated from high school, she enrolled at the Jean Suarez Academy for Beauty to study cosmetology, and she was a motivated and hard-working young woman. She went to cosmetology school during the day, and afterwards she went to another job in the evenings at the JCPenney jewelry counter. From very early on, Susan began spending a lot of time at Josh's apartment and spending nights there. At first, her parents didn't catch on because she was living with her sister Mary at the time, but they would soon figure it out. He proposed to her on January 5th, 2001, less than 2 months after they'd started dating. A few weeks before he popped the question, Josh visited Susan at the jewelry counter at her job, and he told her that he was looking for a gift for his mother, a ring, and would Susan help him pick it out, and then would she buy it with her employee discount. Susan was picking out her own engagement ring, a piece of jewelry that she chose with another woman in mind, not knowing that it was hers. Josh talked about this ring and what it represented to him in his journal. I don't want her to have the most expensive looking ring in the world. I don't want her to have a big rock to attract someone who would want to hurt her or mug us as we're together. I just want her to have a modest ring with the best quality diamond I can possibly find. Something that will tell her that I love her without necessarily acting like a magnet for the attention of the world, the wrong attention from the world. Her family and friends were not super happy about this engagement. Nobody could really figure out what Susan saw in Josh. They didn't have anything in common. He was kind of weird. Kind of treated her in an indifferent sort of way, but what are you gonna do? The heart wants what it wants. And for a guy who was not interested in ever getting married or having kids, just very recently with his ex, Catherine, he wanted to tie the knot with Susan quick. This new urgency in getting married as soon as possible may have had something to do with the fact that Josh was up to his old tricks, spending his girlfriend's money, just as he had done with Catherine. He possibly wanted Susan to be in a position where he'd legally have access to whatever she had, and she couldn't run away like Catherine had. I'm sure at first Susan thought that she was just helping him out. Of course, they were going to be married. This was going to be her husband. That's what husbands and wives do for each other. What's mine is yours. She had no idea how bad it would get. Josh was still in school, and she assumed that once he graduated, he would get a full-time job and start contributing financially. Josh wrote in his journal, Susan's been putting out a lot of money on some of this stuff lately, and I really haven't had the money to do it. And I need a computer to live, to get my classes done, so she's been helping me out with some of it. The day they applied for their marriage license, they got into a big fight, and she said she didn't want to see him and could he drive her home, but he didn't drive her home. Instead, he got her in the car and then he drove to a FedEx where he proceeded to leave her in the car while he went inside to make copies. Later, he wrote in his journal that he hoped she would, calm down and stop being as mad at him while he was in there making the copies. So he was basically trying to buy time for her to cool off. When he got back into the car, she was not cooled off. She was still mad. But instead of driving her home, once again, he drove to the post office and mailed in their marriage application. This should have been a sign If you're getting into a huge argument like this where you don't even want to be around each other, on the day that you're filling out your application to become married, maybe it's a sign to just chill out for a couple of days. Make sure that there's no existing resentments hanging in the air before you mail in paperwork that is the first step to you becoming tied together for an eternity. But I don't think that Josh really gave her much of a choice. She was this passive occupant in his car. He was driving her all over, and he's the one that mailed in the paperwork. They got married in the Portland Temple on April 6th, 2001. Although Josh invited his brothers, sisters, and parents, the only two members of Josh's family who were actually allowed into the temple for the ceremony were Jennifer and Terry, true believers in the church. The temple didn't allow anyone to walk in if they were not active in the religion, so Josh's father, brothers, and sister Lena, who was now heavily under the influence of Steve Powell, all waited outside. It was almost as if as soon as their marriage was legal and binding, as soon as they said, "I do," he flipped the switch. If he'd been odd and withdrawn and judgmental before, now that's pretty much all he was. Josh and Susan spent their wedding night at the Hood River Inn on the Columbia River. This evening would be a sign to Susan of what was to come in their marriage. Josh spent the night playing with his camera. They had the reception the next day, and Steve Powell was in attendance, recording the event on his camcorder. He seemed to especially focus on Susan in this footage. It seemed now that Josh had changed his mind about his sister Jennifer's marriage, which initially he had given low odds of lasting. Now he wanted what she had. "I really want to emulate my sister's marriage. She has a wonderful situation with her husband," he wrote in his journal. He claimed that he knew in his heart he and Susan were real and long-lasting. Because most people don't have our friendship. We talk like most people don't talk in their marriage. Even some people with incredible, awesome marriages, they don't talk like we talk. We talk about everything. I have no idea how Josh knew what other people's marriages were like or what they talked about behind closed doors or among themselves in their marriage, but this is just a sign that he thinks anything that he's affiliated with or anything he's connected to is better than anything anybody else has. But Josh and Susan's marriage from the get-go was not smooth sailing. He had some bad habits that got on his wife's nerves. He was constantly late to everything, all the time, even to his own wedding. He was a habitual procrastinator. He was lazy. He wasn't motivated. He moved at his own pace. He wasn't interested in anybody else's timeline or the reality of a timeline. He did things when and if he wanted to. Susan also kept a journal. She had done so since she was 8. Her father said that she was encouraged to keep a journal because it was good for your future generations to be able to learn from your wisdom and life experiences. In her journal, she wrote, "We did not trust renting and are paying off Josh's debts while he waits to finish his last quarter in school for his bachelor's in business management and get a job, and for his credit to clean up so we can get a loan for a house. I want a house to call mine and come home to, so I can prepare meals for Josh and clean and decorate." This house to clean and decorate would not come anytime soon. In 2002, 9 months after they were married, they were evicted from Josh's apartment. They didn't have any money, even though Susan was working 2 jobs, so they moved in with Steve Powell again in order to save up for their own place. This was when things would get very odd. Steve, John, and Michael were already living there, and an additional 2 people would mean that living conditions were about to get really cramped. They didn't have their own bedroom. They had to sleep in the living room with sheets hung up to kind of give them some privacy, but for a couple who's pretty much in their first year of marriage, considered newlyweds still, this wasn't the kind of privacy that they needed. And Steve Powell always seemed to have his camcorder going. His favorite subject appeared to be his new daughter-in-law. She later would tell a friend that soon after moving in, she began to feel very strange around her father-in-law. She would always catch him looking at her, and one day she caught him trying to watch her while she got undressed. There's a video he recorded from this time where he's focusing the camcorder on her, and he said, "We don't get many girls around here, so you're going to get the full treatment." If the full treatment means being as creepy as possible, as inappropriate as possible, and making your daughter-in-law feel as uncomfortable as possible, that sure is the treatment that she got. Susan initially was grateful for her father-in-law's help, and she was an open and friendly and outgoing girl. But her openness was interpreted by Steve as flirtation. He would later claim in an interview that she would constantly come on to him or tease him. She'd lean over him so that he could smell her hair or have him rub her legs. To hear him talk about it, I guess that it does seem a little strange, but the incident with the legs that he's referring to was actually completely innocent and completely different than he had described it. Susan was in beauty school. She performed waxing services on people, and she waxed her own legs, and she was very proud of herself when she did good work. So one day, while she was clothed, she came in to Steve Powell's office, and they were talking, and she was like, "Oh, I waxed my legs a week ago, and look at this, there's still no hair." And she put her leg up so that he could touch her leg and see that it was still smooth. It wasn't inappropriate, it wasn't sexual, it wasn't flirtation, but Steve Powell's crazy. Susan knew that her father-in-law made her feel uncomfortable, but she didn't know the half of it. It appeared that Steve had developed an attraction to Susan, an obsession, an infatuation for Susan. Very much in the same way he had once felt an inappropriate attraction to his own underage daughter. He not only took pictures and videos of her when she knew about it, but he took pictures and videos of her when she didn't. He had pictures of her in her underwear doing her hair in the bathroom, a picture that was clearly taken through a partially opened door in secret. He began taking her underwear out of the hamper and storing them in sealed and dated bags. He took her sanitary products out of the garbage and stored those in sealed and dated bags. I'm not kidding. I wish I was. When she went into the bathroom, he used a mirror to watch her from underneath the door. Steve Powell also kept a journal, among other things. And during this time, he's very vocal about Susan in these journals and other ways of recording his life and thoughts. He wrote, "What I've written about Susan represents the first time I've mentioned fetish and what might be considered sociopathic. The fact is, I can hardly control myself when it comes to her. I mean, who looks under the bathroom door with a mirror? I tend to think a lot of guys do." He wrote about collecting pieces of hair from her brush and sniffing them. He said that Susan was his greatest problem and greatest passion, and that he fantasized about kissing those lips. One day, when she told him she thought his house was too dark, he considered selling it, writing that if Susan agreed to marry him, he would buy a different one. In her journal, Susan refers to this time staying with Steve Powell as very dark. Josh had progressively been moving away from his faith as time went on, but under the influence of Steve, it became worse and more noticeable. She knew that they had to get out of there in order to properly start their lives as husband and wife. By March of 2002, Josh had gotten a job at the local Home Depot, but he promptly lost it. Luckily, Susan got a raise and a promotion at her job. Using what money she had, they were able to move out of Steve Powell's house and move into their own apartment in Yakima. I guess renting didn't sound too bad now, faced with the alternative. The following June, Josh graduated from business school, and Susan was there to support him, and so was Steve Powell, with his camcorder once again training it on his daughter-in-law. I imagine that Susan thought once Josh graduated, he would settle down, get a full-time job, and start contributing. But Josh had never been good at following rules, and he always thought he was smarter and better than everybody else, and this was not an exception when it came to employers, so he could not keep a job. Like I said, this is a theme with Josh Powell. He's the kind of guy who wants to be his own boss, wants to start his own business, wants to become a multimillionaire, but he has no intention of putting in any work or effort to do it. He wants it to be no effort or low effort, or he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He even considered enlisting in the military when his younger brother Michael did, but that thought passed as soon as it occurred to him. I'm sure we all know people like this, but Josh Powell took it to a whole new level. Even though they were no longer living with Steve, Steve Powell could not get Susan off of his mind. He would drive to Yakima and tape Susan without her knowing while she walked into work. He would tape Susan while Josh was dropping her off at work and they were talking in the car. He would tape Susan and Josh through the windows of their bedroom while they were in bed together. Steve would also visit his son and his daughter-in-law, and one of these times when Josh wasn't home, Steve offered to give Susan a back rub, a massage. When he got home, he set up his camcorder, got in front of it, and as he undressed, he relished the memory of it out loud. I just had what is probably the most erotic experience I've had in my entire life. He explained in great detail what parts of Susan he had touched, saying she didn't even mind, that she seemed to enjoy it. What Susan had seen as an innocent favor from her father-in-law, Steve had perceived as an open invitation to continue his obsession with her. I have long known that they have had a very unstable relationship and that Josh was only using her as a means to a financial end. There's never any money for her to do nice things for herself because all their money goes to pay off debts Josh accumulated while he was single and living with Catherine. And while he has a good point, it's pretty clear that he has no good intentions at this time. Essentially, he's imagining a world where Josh and Susan are no longer married and he can have Susan to himself. He wasn't shy about expressing these feelings to other people. He told his friends, he told his daughter Alina. One of his friends told him he needed to back off because coming between his son's marriage wasn't going to be a really good thing for their family. Steve Powell had many, many videos of himself doing things on camera, usually featuring an article of Susan's underwear or pictures of her. He did many things, guys. Disgusting, disturbing things. The things he said and did on those videotapes, I obviously cannot say them in here, but I have a document that has them in it, and I'll link it in the description box if you're interested. After a while, Josh got self-righteous at work again, and he started going to HR about this senior living care facility that he was working at, saying that they were asking him to do illegal things. And so he no longer had that job, but he was going to be going on a new endeavor, a new career path. He was going to be a trucker. On July 13th, 2003, Josh gave it a try for the first time, going on his first ride with a big rig. Susan, his wife, was there to see him off, and so was his father, Steve Powell, with his video camera again. When Josh disappeared into the distance, Steve, who was harboring all these feelings and emotions for Susan, offered to give her a ride to her parents' house, which was about an hour away. She accepted, and he recorded her with his camcorder getting into the car. He thought that he turned the camcorder off once she was in the car, but he didn't. And so we actually have audio of that conversation that they had, and it's very hard to listen to. Essentially, the gist of what happened is he told her, I have feelings for you. I'm in love with you. While she was trapped in the passenger seat of a moving vehicle. He told her, for the last year and a half, you're about the only thing I can think about. I don't know where it began. It probably began when you were living with me, when you would come into my office and let me feel your legs, your smooth legs. And it just went from one thing to another. The experience on your couch 6 months ago, it was a massage, right? But just being with you for 2 hours and holding you. And Susan says nothing. She's silent. What could she say? What would you say? He keeps talking when she doesn't respond. Maybe he took it as permission to continue his inappropriate advances, and he says, maybe I'm getting the wrong signals from you. Maybe I'm interpreting something that I shouldn't be interpreting. You know, for example, when we were sitting on the couch, it felt like you were, I was extremely aroused, and I felt that you were somewhat aroused, at least I thought. Finally, she says, I don't know where you're going with this. I'm your daughter-in-law. I'm your son's wife. I should be to you one step under your own children. So, he should have gotten the message at this point, right? She's being very clear that she's uncomfortable, that it's weird, that she's not about it, but he doesn't get the message. Kind of like Josh never used to get the message with all those girls that he was interested in, and he would keep pursuing even when they told him they weren't interested. He said to her, Susan, when your daughter-in-law walks into your office and shows you her legs, you know what I'm saying? She says, I'm sorry that I did that, and we can't undo it, so let's try to forget it. The ride continues. Like I said, it's an hour drive, so it continues pretty much in silence. Susan tries to return to normal conversation, but Steve redirects her again, and he asks her if she's upset at him for talking to her like that, and she responds, no, it's nice that you said something so that I can now make it clear to you how I feel and we don't have to worry about this anymore. And he says to her, I appreciate that. I really do. Are you going to talk to Josh about this? And she responds, is there anything I don't talk to Josh about? And then gets out of the car. So Steve Powell goes to his daughter Alina, and he's like, man, I really thought we had something, me and Susan, and then she just told me like she wasn't interested in the car. And Alina, another female, another young girl, she doesn't say, Dad, this is insane. This is your son's wife. You need to back off. She says, Susan's a tease. Steve wrote in his journal, I am in so much pain right now. I don't know where to turn with it. I spoke to Alina, who's been very supportive of my infatuation or obsession. Her advice was to accept that Susan is a player. And that's what players do. They lead guys on. This will probably be one of the last entries about Susan, my desire, and my love for her. It wasn't his last entry, not by a long shot, because he reviewed the video once he figured out that the camcorder had caught the audio, and he heard something completely different than what actually happened during that conversation. The conclusion he drew from hearing the conversation played back was that it hadn't been a hard no from Susan. There was still a chance. You would think once Susan told Josh about this that he would be upset with his father, that there would be serious issues in the relationship between father and son going forward. And initially he was upset, but then Steve told Josh that, hey, your wife led me on. She was having me feel her legs. She's done this to me. What was I supposed to do but to react to it? And then Josh was like, good point, and did nothing. So imagine being in Susan's shoes, right? Your father-in-law gets you alone in a car, tells you he's sexually attracted to you and, wants to be with you. You tell him that's not going to happen. Then you tell your husband what his father did, and your husband does nothing. She must have voiced her concerns loudly and often enough to have Josh at least understand and agree that it was a good idea to get out of Washington State. So they moved to Utah. Steve helped them move, and he wrote about it in his journal. He said, I helped them clear out their apartment Wednesday. Now Josh doesn't need me for a while. It's interesting that he was upset at me for telling Susan I loved her, but needed my help too much to stay away. Steve also had access to a storage unit that Josh and Susan shared, and while he was helping them move, he would go into the storage unit and look around. There's an entry in his journal dated January 11th, 2003, where Steve says, I've had access to their storage room for a few days and couldn't help but notice two enticing storage boxes, one labeled Susan's photos and one Susan's journals. When it comes to Susan, I stop at nothing. I help myself to everything in those boxes and have scanned hundreds of pages and photos. I don't feel in the least guilty about these things. I scanned everything into my computer and now have copies of dozens of early pictures in all her journals up to late 2003. If she loves me as I think she does, she will not be upset. In fact, she will be thrilled that I'm so interested in her. Josh hasn't read them and never will. As I've already said, Susan kept a journal and had kept a journal for many years, but of course the things inside of these journals were private, especially from her teenage years. She talked about friends and crushes and things that she was feeling inside, things that a man in his 50s should not have been helping himself to, much less scanning into his computer for his future use. What Steve didn't like about the journals, though, was that there wasn't enough talk about Steve. He was confused, as he wrote in his own journal, about the presence of himself in her journals. What's most profound to me is there's nothing positive said about me. I'm almost a footnote. And with all the other negative comments about me, she doesn't mention a word about my sexual proclivities, which include taking video clips of her from head to foot. It's too bad she is silent about sexual magnetism between us. It would have been an interesting read. I would have even enjoyed it if she had called me Satan incarnate for trying to lead her into sexual sin, but there is nothing. So it's clear that not only is Steve Powell a troubled man, but a very delusional man, and his son Josh was not too far behind him. So I'm going to end part one here. We pretty much covered all of Josh Powell's background, which is very important to what happens in the future. We covered how he acted as a teenager with his relationships, how he treated his ex-girlfriend Catherine, how he and Susan met, their wedding, the beginning of their marriage, Steve Powell's obsessive, crazy, and inappropriate infatuation with his daughter-in-law, Susan. And now they're moving to Utah. So we'll pick up part two, where they've arrived in Utah and things just get worse. Thank you guys so much for being here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Stay kind and stay beautiful. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
As on the road, look on